Candidates that are advocates for change in Chicago. Don't give up. The fundraiser starts at 6 p.m. at Edelweiss German-American Restaurant in Norwich. Tickets are $100. They include 2 drinks plus appetizers. There are options to direct your donations to specific candidates or to the NWS GOP Shared Fund. Find out all the details and secure your tickets for tomorrow night. NWSGOP.com, NWSGOP.com.
Welcome back to the show. And one of the reasons that blue states, deep blue states with deep blue big cities are such sewers is because the leadership that could come from outside of the political realm or that could hold those erstwhile ruling class politicians accountable decides instead to throw in with them, no matter how ridiculous their reigns are. And Chicago is ground zero for that. The latest piece of evidence I'd like to submit for your consideration. Dear Mayor Lightfoot, today Chicago, like cities across our nation, is at a crossroads. The pandemic, racial strife, and recession are a triple threat. Oh, interesting choice of phraseology, considering you're talking to the triple threat.
That's her line.
Right. I'm black, female, lesbian. That makes me a triple threat. Lori Lightfoot's value proposition as a candidate for mayor. Mm-hmm.
She likes it lesbian, female, black, by the way.
The pandemic, racial strife, and recession are a triple threat to our hometown. We commend you and your team for your steadfast leadership in navigating the city through the crisis. High marks for Lori Lightfoot and her team of socialist facilitators for their stewardship during the last 2 years. Is that what you would give Lori Lightfoot? High marks? While the task ahead is daunting, Chicago has a unique opportunity to rebuild in a way that ensures we emerge stronger, fairer, and more resilient. This is all an all-hands-on-deck moment. No one can rebuild our beloved city alone. Only when our political leaders, the business community, civic groups, religious organizations, nonprofits, and cultural institutions join forces with a shared vision and effort, can we succeed. And what's that shared vision? So today, as business leaders responsible for employing thousands of Chicagoans, we're stepping up to stand with you and the Chicago Community Trust. We support Together We Rise for an Equitable and Just Recovery, the initiative you announced on October 8th to ensure an equitable and just recovery through financial and in-kind investments. And it's signed by a lot of Champaign socialists, to be fair, but also George McCaskey, chairman of Chicago Bears, Rocky Wirtz, Blackhawks, Jerry Reinsdorf over at the White Sox, Joe Mansueto, Chicago Fire. Did you hear that, John Cass? And many other CEOs. Again, many of them are Champaign socialists who were otherwise doyens of the left anyway. But nonetheless, do you want to understand why? Why the decisions that are made? Why you can have failure perpetuated in spite of so many talented people, in spite of so many great institutions, or at least once great institutions? It's because, as they say in their letter, everybody throws in with the mayor, no matter how much of a cynical, identitarian, incompetent hack she is, and her socialist facilitators on the city council and in charge of so many of these institutions. And that's how you get the worst governed city in America in the worst governed state in American history. For more on blue state sewers, we're pleased to be joined again by Steve Malanga, who is at the Manhattan Institute, contributing editor to City Journal. Steve, thanks for joining us. Appreciate it.
How are you?
Good. You've written recently on an aspect of these blue state sewers, as I term them, and that is with respect to infrastructure, something politicians like to carry on about and sometimes fall considerably short of delivering. So, for example, it is worth noting that Illinois, the transportation hub of the Midwest, according to the American Society of Civil Engineers, gets grades like this for its bridges, roads, and transit. You know, our comparative advantage, transportation infrastructure, C's and D pluses, bridges, roads, and transit in terms of infrastructure vitality. And boy, you'd be shocked to hear that after Governor Pritzker doubled the state gas tax just a couple of years ago, and you've had intermittent, multi billion-dollar infrastructure investment projects, shovel-ready, so on and so forth. But it turns out these big blue states with big blue transportation systems are big money pits, Steve.
Yeah, actually, that's been an issue for a very long time. One of the things that struck me a couple of years ago was I was looking at a whole bunch of blue states that were talking about raising taxes as that kind of cycle got on. And at the same time, I was writing a piece on infrastructure, and there are all these, ratings of infrastructure quality that are done by, non-political, groups like the engineers and so forth. And it struck me that the highest taxed states that I was looking at also had the worst infrastructure in the country. And I said to myself, how is this possible? Not only that, but the best infrastructure rated were places like Texas and Florida, which don't even have an income tax. Tennessee with very low rates. And it really boggles my mind. And, I actually eventually wrote a piece in the Wall Street Journal about this thing. There seems to be no relationship between the high tax blue state model and quality. And I went into a whole bunch of areas, not just infrastructure. I looked at things like education. I looked at things like housing affordability, inequality. People talk so much about inequality, and it's mostly progressives who talk about it, but the places that are most unequal are the progressive states that are taxing people the most in order to end inequality, according to their. So there's no actual parallel between high tax rates and quality of services, and you have to assume that that's because the high taxes are actually being, if you will, swallowed up by big government, not necessarily being put to effective uses.
And you wrote, too, in your article about 7 of the 8 states with the highest percentage of people who want to move elsewhere are solidly Democratic. And that Illinois is included in that, that's for sure.
And they're related. I'll give you an example. We did a poll a couple of months ago for residents of asking residents of New York City, because, of course, of the impact of the pandemic there, whether they were intending to leave or not, or wanted to leave or not, and and what was bothering them about the city beyond, obviously, the pandemic itself. And while we found a lot of people said they wanted to leave if they could, the most interesting thing was that they said what upset them the most was they weren't getting value for their taxes. Everybody knows that New York City is a high tax place, and it's especially a high tax place, of course, for wealthy people, although there are a lot of smaller taxes and fees that really chip away if you're even middle class. But the point was they felt they weren't getting value for money, and that is the issue. It's a little bit like going into, I don't know, a Walmart or a Macy's or a Neiman Marcus, wherever you are on the economic scale. If you feel you're being fleeced, you know what I mean, right? It's a value. I mean, in retailing, they actually talk about value, the price-value equation. Well, in government, they don't talk about it a lot, and they assume people will just, go along. But clearly, the out-migration patterns show that people don't go along, that at some point they get upset and they leave.
Well, that's it. And actually, in Illinois, just to punctuate what you were saying, Jimmy John Leotu, the founder of the Jimmy John sandwich franchise, that's exactly what he said several years ago when he moved his corporate headquarters out of Illinois. And remember, his business started in Champaign, central Illinois, to Florida. And he said, look, I've been successful in life. I've done well. I'm happy to pay taxes. The thing that riles me about Illinois is the money I send to Springfield doesn't go where they say it's going to go. And there was somebody that was actually connecting inputs to outputs, which very few people do, including so many of the corporate titans and other civic and institutional leaders. Illinois has the highest combined state and local tax burden in the country, and yet you just heard the grades with respect to the state's infrastructure. We're one of the worst states in the nation when it comes to providing services to the developmentally disabled. We have some of the worst school systems in the country, starting in Chicago. So I'm sorry, what is the return on my investment?
Well, and here's something else, okay? You asked this question, why are states that are collecting so much in taxes and always raising taxes, why are they ineffective? And I'll tell you something else that recently just came out. Just a couple of days ago, the University of Chicago's, the University of Illinois at Chicago's Department of Political Science, periodically they do a corruption index for the states. and they basically measure how many people have been indicted by the federal government by state. And if you look at the long term over the last 20 to 30 years, Illinois is number one. California is number two. New York, the Southern District, Manhattan, is number three. So you have to think to yourselves, right? If you have governments that are persistently corrupt and they're collecting a lot of taxes, maybe there's a relationship, right? You look at the fact that it costs so much in some of these blue states to actually build infrastructure because they do things like pay off their political supporters with things like prevailing wage provisions and all these other things that drive up the cost. And so you look at the study that comes out just a couple of days ago, and the most corrupt places in terms of indictments of public officials are three very, very blue areas. And so you have to wonder, is there a relationship between that and the fact that you have poorer services than you should be getting?
Well, that's what interesting, because the Sacramento Bee just recently opined on this, the Democrat political class corruption in California, and sort of lamenting, and this is the Sacramento Bee, which is not exactly a conservative outlet, lamenting that probably nobody will listen to Republicans in a state that's supermajority Democrat controlled. Yeah, well, maybe if the Fourth Estate wasn't also throwing in with the government for the past half century, maybe some more people would wake up and would listen. But that's precisely it. I say this all the time. When people ask, does the mafia still exist in Chicago? I say it sure does. It's just that in the 21st century, we call them alderman, state rep, state senator, governor, mayor.
Well, there seems to be some kind of a relationship here. The most interesting thing, though, and I don't really know how to interpret this, is that as the Democratic Party moves more and more to the left, the people on the left are attacking, I guess, what you would call establishment Democratic corruption. For better or for worse, they're looking, of course, to replace that whole group. And so we see what's going on in New York, where Governor Cuomo, who for years has been bulletproof because he could count on his allies in the Democratic Party, suddenly there are very left-of-center people up in Albany in places of power, and they're doing investigations. And now, every day, there's bad news about Cuomo. And suddenly this guy went from being an Emmy Award winner for his press conferences on the pandemic to now they're trying to mount an impeachment of him. And, of course, Gavin Newsom in California is in a recall battle, and though it was started by a lot of Republicans and people on the right, people on the left are joining it, Democrats are joining it, and that's his problem right now. So there's a weird dynamic going on in America where both the right and the far left are saying, let's get rid of the establishment of people who've run these places, and we're seeing some really real political upheavals as a result of that.
Except in Illinois. Steve Malanga, Manhattan Institute, contributing editor, City Journal. Steve, thanks for joining us. Appreciate it.
Thank you. Take care.
Thanks, Steve. It was a pleasure, and he joined us on our turnkey.pro answer line.
You're listening to Chicago's Morning Answer with Dan Proft and Amy Jacobson on AM 560. The Answer.
Nobody wants to need an attorney, but when you do, you need to find the right firm. The one that shares your values and will take your case personally. That's Cuda Law. You get the entire Cuda Law team working on your case. Even the cell phone number of your lead attorney. Cuda Law wins. Go to CUDALaw.com. Cuda Law has the experience to get you a victory with any kind of personal injury, workers' compensation, medical malpractice, or COVID-related injuries or work injuries. Cuda Law wins. And you're not a number. You're not a case. You're a person that needs help. The Cuda Law team takes it personally and will put in the time and effort to get you the best outcome. Go to CUDALaw.com. CUDALaw.com. Cuda Law wins. Talk about your case and get real honest advice from the only law firm that wants to win as bad as you do. Cuda Law. You can chat with them too right now at CUDA.